Hi, this is part of a series, Cases of the Four Courts, about 19th century cases in the Four Courts, Dublin, Ireland. And the case I want to talk about today is the case of Bagot and Bagot, which was a probate case involving a challenge to the will of Christopher Neville Bagot on the grounds of insane delusion. And the challenge was brought by his wife Alice, who, along with her newborn child, was entirely left out of the will. And I suppose I'll start by talking about Christopher Neville Bagot because that's a key feature of the narrative. So Christopher Neville Bagot was about 50 at the time of his death. He was from a Roscommon family and had made a fortune in the Australian gold rush. He then bought an estate in Galway called Upran, but he didn't live there. Instead, he got a suite of rooms in the Alexandra Hotel in Hyde Park Gate, and he plunged into London society. He was very popular as he was handsome, a good horseman, and of course very rich, and his nickname in London society was the Nugget. Unfortunately, a few years after moving to London, his health broke down, and it was at this time that he met the Werner family, Alice and her brothers and sisters, and they were teenagers at the time, and they were largely unchaperoned. They used to visit him in the Alexandra Hotel, and when they went to Nice after Christmas one year, Christopher Neville Bagot went as well. And during that trip to Nice, Christopher and Alice spent all their time together. And when Alice returned from Nice, she was pregnant. A wedding ceremony was subsequently carried out in the Alexandra Hotel in the presence of Alice and her family. And following that wedding ceremony, a few weeks later, a child was born to Alice Bagot. But after the birth, the relationship between Christopher and Alice deteriorated, and he went back with his family to Upran, where he died. When I say his family, I mean his family from Roscommon, the Bagot family. They came and took him back. Alice and the child did not go with him. And although Christopher had initially not acknowledged the child as his, putting his name on their birth certificate, before he died, he began to deny this. And Alice's challenge to the will, which completely excluded her and her son, was based on this exclusion having been due to what she called an insane delusion, that her son was not his, but the child of another man. So paternity was absolutely central to this case. So the case took 22 days to be heard in the Four Courts before Judge Warren in the Probate Court. And this is the gentleman who represented the Bagot family. He's Francis MacDonagh, who is a famous QC in Ireland in the 19th century. And he faced a number of difficulties in making his case for the validity of the will, in particular, the presumption of legitimacy. So the presumption of legitimacy, which is still in force theoretically, provided that if a child was born to a woman who was married, it was presumed to be that of the husband's. This could be rebutted, but it was difficult to rebut in the days before DNA evidence. So it was clear that Christopher, at the time of his death, believed that the child was not his, but for the Bagots, actually proving this was another question, especially as the baby had definitely been conceived at Nice, and the person Alice had spent all her time with at Nice was Christopher. So MacDonagh sought to argue that the child could not have been Christopher's because Christopher was incapable of sexual intercourse at the time of the trip to Nice. The medical evidence, he called, was somewhat inconclusive, and it also turned out from that medical evidence that Christopher's illness was due to late-stage syphilis. He had locomotor ataxia, which was a symptom of that illness. Some evidence was given as part of the Bagot family case about Christopher's previous history with women, which was extensive. One witness called in the case who was not helpful to the Bagots was their own solicitor, William Fry. And William Fry was asked about a case for counsel that he had prepared at Christopher Bagot's request when he was considering a separation from Alice Bagot. And the case to counsel, which had been approved by Christopher Bagot before sending, contained a statement that Christopher Bagot had had sexual intercourse with Alice before marriage. And that statement really rebutted the medical evidence that MacDonagh was seeking to rely on. So this came out in the cross-examination of William Fry and was not particularly helpful to his client's case. So McDonough fell back on excoriating Alice. He said that Alice was fast and loose. He put forward various notes that she'd written to Christopher Bagot to try to find innuendo in them. It really was a muck-slinging exercise. And Alice was very lucky that she had an excellent counsel, because Gerald Fitzgibbon, QC, who acted for Alice, you can see a photograph of him here, in his opening statement, he completely reframed the narrative that had been put forward by the Bagot family, that Alice was an opportunist and a gold digger. And he said that this was a totally different story. This was a situation where Christopher Neville Bagot, a man with a long history of seducing women, by his own admission, because he boasted about this in his visits to medical practitioners, that had already come out. So a man with a long history of seducing women had made friends with a 19-year-old girl who was virtually unchaperoned. Her only chaperone was her younger brother, had given her lots of presents, and Fitzgibbon went so far as to say that Christopher Neville Bagot had gone through a sham marriage ceremony with Alice, which she believed was real, prior to the visit to Nice, and it was on that basis that she had had sexual intercourse with him when she was in Nice. She believed they were married, and it was only when he admitted later that they weren't that she insisted on a further marriage ceremony taking place with her family present. So Fitzgibbon went on to say that the real reason for the disintegration in relations between the couple was nothing to do with paternity, or would not have occurred, but for the insinuations of the Bagot family, who went to visit the couple after the child was born, put all sorts of notions into Christopher Neville Bagot's head about Alice's promiscuity, and also put notions into her head about him, because they showed her pictures of his previous mistresses and so forth, and that upset her and relations broke down. So at the end of Fitzgibbon's opening statement, the narrative was reframed, and the next witness who came in to give evidence was Alice herself. And Alice was an excellent witness. She stood up very well to cross-examination. She affirmed that she'd never had intercourse with anyone other than Neville Bagot. She told about the previous wedding that she had believed to be valid. She talked about the Bagots and how they had told her about his previous mistresses, and she had got upset about it, and she'd fallen out with Christopher Neville. And the next thing she knew, she was never allowed back into his room again. The Bagot family took him completely over and excluded her and her child. And there then followed on Alice's evidence to the effect that in fact men who suffered from locomotor ataxia, which was Neville's condition, were capable of fathering children. And in fact, one practitioner who was attending Neville gave evidence that he had given Neville phosphorus injections prior to the visit to Nice, and that those injections tended to increase potency in men with locomotor ataxia. So that, together with the statement in the case to counsel prepared by William Fry, that Neville and Alice had sexual intercourse, that really undermined the Bagot family's argument that Neville was not capable of fathering a child. And a couple of other witnesses also had impact. Alice's maid, Grindley, gave evidence about Alice's mistreatment by the Bagots and her complete exclusion by them from Neville's life. And then finally there was a servant from Aughran who gave evidence as to Neville's last days, and when inebriated he used to sob about the loss of his wife and children. So the defence case was very well put together, a great opening statement, and it was followed through by quite strong evidence. So Judge Warren's summing up was brief, but he made a couple of important points. He pointed out that Alice had a fortune of her own, and she was a woman of beauty, and that she could have done a lot better than Neville Bagot. So clearly he wasn't taking the idea that she was hunting him seriously. And earlier, Judge Warren had drawn attention to the fact that there didn't seem to be an alternative plausible candidate for paternity, and that was another key point in the case. So it won't surprise you after all that to hear that the jury found in favour of Alice, who was cheered out of court. And although the Bagot family appealed, the appeal was settled on terms favourable to Alice and her son. Alice remarried shortly afterwards, though her marriage broke up and she died at 55. And I suppose one unspoken thought must have been whether Neville had passed on to her his medical condition. Was that why she died so young? So that's the story of Bagot and Bagot. This wouldn't happen today because there are statutory provisions which preclude a spouse from disinheriting their wife and children. But in those days, often the only recourse was to argue on soundness of mind. And that's what was done successfully in the Bagot case. Thanks very much. Thank you.